Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I do feel the necessity in answering a couple of the questions that were just asked by my colleague from Nevada. If you'll recall, March 21st of 2020, this Congress passed the CARES Act, the biggest single bill that I have ever seen in my tenure in Congress. It was well north of $1 trillion. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was thought it was necessary to be able to withstand some of the blows that we were in line to receive from this terrible disease that was visited upon us by another country. But the damaging thing was not so much in just spending the money. I'll still argue that the money was necessary. The damaging thing was we never went back and sort of looked at what was necessary. For example, I'm a physician. We put $150 billion in the Provider Relief Fund, arguably a good thing, but we really didn't know what the dollar figure was to put into the Provider Relief Fund. We had no organized plan. I'm also on the Energy and Commerce Committee. We're the major authorizing committee for healthcare expenditures. We never once had a hearing, a single hearing before or after passing that $1.1 trillion bill. We never had a single hearing of what was actually necessary to help our healthcare sector who'd been delivered this terrible blow by the coronavirus. And as a consequence, we had funds that were unspent that were probably necessary somewhere else. And then in December, we'd come back and add more money on top of that. So I would simply argue that Mr. Moore, I think, has pointed out that by June of 2020, things were starting to stabilize. And our CBO director, Mr. Swagel, has told us that the economy going into the coronavirus, and I think, Mr. Mayor, you've kind of underscored this. Going into the coronavirus, the economy was actually doing pretty darn well. As Jack Kemp taught us, the rising tide was lifting all boats. Then we were delivered this terrible blow. But honestly, to never go back and look at what we did, what was necessary, if more is necessary, we can have that discussion. But then here's the real damaging thing. We get to February of 2021 and we pass a $1.9 trillion bill that is entirely partisan. It's passed under reconciliation, guaranteed that we're not going to have.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. You can get your chairman to yield to, I'm sure he will. Guaranteed that it was going to be a partisan exercise and that no voices on the Republican side would be heard. And yet you can see just by the attendance here today in this hearing, yeah, on the Republican side, we're terribly interested in what this bill was going to do and what this bill did do. And here's the other part of the problem. When you pass that bill in February of 2021, right, you're not a prognosticator. You don't know what's going to happen in August. But what if you have the most humiliating defeat that the United States has ever encountered in the country of Afghanistan and the leader absconds with all the money? And then, because we all know from President Reagan that weakness is provocative, and then you see the invasion of Ukraine, which anybody could have predicted because the Russian army was aggregated around the borders. What did you think was going to happen? So what was your plan for this? Well, turns out there was no plan. We were told by the same geniuses who couldn't predict Afghanistan, we were told by those same folks that Ukraine would fall in 3 days. 3 days, Kiev would be under the control of the Russians. Completely underestimating the fact that Ukrainians have shown in the past and shown again repetitively that they are willing to fight for their own homeland. So look, forgive me if I am skeptical about some of the discourse that we've heard here this morning. It almost sounds like we're stuck in a Charles Dickens novel. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. But Mr. Moore, let me just give you the last word here. You've been through all this. You saw it from the inside of the administration. You saw what was going to happen. You're bound to have had misgivings as you saw what this committee was going to do in February of last year.
Well, let me just give you one example of the kind of crazy spending priorities in this bill. So we spent more money under the American Recovery Act on subsidizing the New York subway system than we did on therapies and treatments. I mean, how lunatic is that, really? I mean, we talk about a misallocation of resources. I urge all of the members of this panel, we spent $1.9 trillion. There was a front page story in the New York Times about 3 or 4 weeks ago, 140 billion, not 140 million, 140 billion was ripped off from the unemployment benefit program. That didn't stimulate the American economy. It stimulated economies in Africa and South America. Half of the fraudsters didn't even live in the United States. So can we please do a thorough investigation of what happened in the Medicaid funding, unemployment insurance program, the food stamp program, you mentioned the rental assistance program. The fraud rates were 20% in a lot of these programs. A private sector program is about a 2% fraud rate. We cannot allow that to persist.
We cannot allow. Thank you, Mr. Moore. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentlemen,